Hey everyone, welcome to Fantasy Footy. Fan Jeff here. Now you'll notice looking at my team, now this video of course is a pre-season games review, but just quickly, you may have noticed on my team I still have Adams in there, Winhager, even Williams, a few rookies probably need to be changed. I haven't touched my team. I'm going to wait till round 0, wait till all those games finish, and then I'm going to come back and review my team, and I'll do a video and upload it straight after the round 0 games as a review and also an update to my team. But straight off the bat, I just want to say that whilst we're paying closer attention to the preseason games compared to the match sims in the previous week, there's a few things that we really do have to keep in mind. None of these games are played at the AFL regular season standard as far as pressure and intensity goes, even in structure and strategy. All those things, the coaches are trying different things and even have planned a few different things for the preseason games. So the preseason games are just giving us an idea, I guess, of how things will probably structure up. Except for, say, players who have played in a particular position for many years and then they play in that position again in the preseason games. That gives us a good indication of how they're going to go. For example, you've got Bont. He has played in the midfield for many years, up forward, I guess, as well, but recently in the midfield, and he played in the midfield again for the Doggies in the preseason game, and he did really well. So that'll obviously give us a good indication of how he's going to go. But again, we've got to remember the pressure and the intensity is not the same. So you've got players playing a little bit more loosely and not really manning up how they normally would in an AFL game. So we've got to keep that in mind, that they're not playing that tight pressure kind of game that they would play in an AFL regular season game. We also have to remember that teams had 8 on a bench, so probably before they brought those extra players on, that was probably how they may have structured up. But again, we've got to remember they did have those extended players to use on their bench. And many years ago, Dane Swan said that gun players, the good players, they do not try in preseason games. Another thing to keep in mind. So if you have a premium that may not have done as well as you would have liked, like an LDU or a Sicily, and we'll get into them a little bit later, not to worry, not to panic, because these premiums are premiums for a reason. They've averaged high averages for the past few years, not because of one preseason game. They're not going to just have a horrible year, unless, of course, there's a change in their role. Then that's of course a little bit different, or if they're carrying an injury or something like that. So I'm only going to talk about relevant players in each of the games. I'm not going to go through every single player, but players who I think are relevant for Supercoach. So starting off with the Magpies and the Tigers game. So we've got to remember that Pendlebury and Howe didn't play for the Pies, and Lynch and Vlosten and Nank didn't play for the Tigers. So starting off with the Pies, now Finn McRae, now he came on sort of halfway through that third quarter, or halfway to late in that third quarter, but he got all of his CBAs in the last quarter. So he had 10 possessions, he scored 29 points in 36% game time. So in my opinion, as I've said for a while now, I don't think Finn McRae is in that best 22. I think there's every chance that he will either be the sub or that he'll miss. I'll be very interested to see if he is in the best 22, who they kick out of that grand final side, but I just don't see it happening. Even though the Pies do need to get more games into him this year, otherwise I can see McRae leaving the Pies next year for a permanent role at another team. Now, the Pies midfield, they had Dacos, Degoe, and Mitchell in that midfield, and Crisp rotated through, and Pendlebury, when he's back in the team, he'll rotate through as well. So where Finn McRae fits in, I'm not exactly sure. If one of these players gets injured, then yeah, no doubt he'll come back into the team. Now, Dacos, He didn't play in that last quarter, but he still scored 102 from 57% game time, and he was just cruising. He's going to have a monster of a year, in my opinion. Degoe, he had 111 in 69% game time. So if you're wanting to go for a pod such as Degoe, then I think he's every chance that he could actually average over 100 this year for sure. So he's 5% owned, bit of a pod, but I actually think he will definitely crack that 100 point. A good year in the midfield that he had last year, and he'll just build on that. So if you've got Degoe, barring injury, I think he'll have a really good year. Now Charlie Dean, he got 47 in 37% game time, and he came on in the second half of the game. Now he's rookie priced, only 2% owned, understandably rookie priced, but it just really depends on what Collingwood is going to do here. So he's unlikely to start in round 0, but Nathan Murphy is not going to be coming back into that team because he's got his concussion issues. So it could be that Charlie Dean comes in, or maybe Frampton stays in the side and plays down back. And we also have to remember Jeremy Howe needs to come back into that side as well. So we'll see what they do. There. Now, going over to Richmond, Jaden Short, he had 27 possessions and 120 points. So will this be the year that he finally cracks that 100-point average? As you can see, a 98.6 average last year, and he's averaged in the mid to high 90s in the last few years, playing off halfback. But he's playing under Adam Uze, so there's every chance that Uze could use him differently, and maybe he will crack that 100-point average. But yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. And of course, we've got round 0 next week with a lot of these players, so we'll be able to see how Short goes then. The other player from the Tigers that's of interest is Thomas Dow. So 4% owned, 254k player in the midfield. He had 20 possessions and a goal in 82% game time for 96 points. So that's pretty decent, obviously. And we'll see, I guess, next week in round 0 whether he gets the same amount of game time and the same amount of mid time as well. Now, Naismith, he's 29% owned, and that makes perfect sense. His ownership has really jumped. So he's a 123k ruck. He had 13 possessions in 69% game time for 82 points. So Nank is suffering plantar fasciitis. Now, if you've ever had plantar fasciitis, it's very painful under the heel. They could just give him a cortisone shot, and maybe that might help him to come back into the side. But yeah, we just don't know how it's being treated. Also remember too that Nat 5 had plantar fasciitis last year, and he missed a lot of games. And I think in an interview, I didn't research it, I heard it somewhere, but in an interview, Nank, I believe he said that he's going to be back in the early part of the season. So, he may actually miss a few games. And Naismith, hopefully, will make us enough cash before Nank comes back into the team. Now, Dusty, he had, so he's 7% owned, 527k. He had 18 possessions in 72% game time for 61 points. He looks good, but I think his Supercoach years are past him. I think he'll actually have a pretty good year because he just still looks great and moves well. But I just think as far as Supercoach goes, is there upside? Will he get more than that 94 average he got last year? I don't see it. Again, depends on how Uze uses him. He could use him purely in the midfield, but we'll just see. Time will tell. We'll have a look in round 0 anyway. The other player from Richmond to have a look at was Gibkiss. So he's 52% owned, and that's probably off the back of this game. He had 18 how many possessions did he have? Oh, actually, I forgot how many possessions he has. But he scored 62 points in 81% game time. There's pretty slim chance that we're gonna have many options in defense. And the fact that he scored 62 points, I think that he is an option, but probably will be a slow burn for us. So I think with him, yeah, we just might need to, I guess, have him, but must be patient with him, I guess. 150k. I think there's some 123k defenders coming through. But again, we'll see in round 0 and see how he goes. So in the Melbourne and Carlton games, we have to remember that Lockie Hunter, who normally plays on the wing, he didn't play. Oliver didn't play either. And for Carlton, Sam Walsh didn't play. Wiedering and Zach Williams didn't play down back. So the big talking point out of this was Max Gawn. Now, Max Gawn, he was on 111 at halftime. He was on 159 by three-quarter time. He finished on 188. So his ownership was at 50%, I think, before the game, and now, of course, it's at 58%. So again, as we've said, he's rucking solo. All the research, all the stats from the past all point to him having a really big year rucking solo. And he proved that in this game. Caleb Windsor, he was the other talking point from this game. So his ownership has jumped as well to 33%. Now he's 180k, so he's a bit of an expensive rook in the forward line. And he scored 78 points in 66% game time, but that did include 2 goals. So he'll likely play in round 1 and play on the wing. He's not kicking 2 goals a game. So, we've got to ask ourselves, if he's going to average around that 70 to 80 point mark, is he going to be worth it at 180k? We've got to see, what kind of forward rooks is going to be available to us at that, 123k average. I know Cooper Simpson is one that people are looking at in the forward line as a cheap rook. Reef McInnes, I know some are, only 3% have him, but so there's a couple that might be coming through. We'll have a look at round 0. Sam Darcy, 18% owned. We'll talk about him a bit later. Bailey Laurie, so here's the other one that might get a game, 125k in the forward line. He got 58 points in 73% game time, which is not too bad. So he might get a game. And of course, Cadman is also an option. He's a key forward. How he's going to go, I'm not too sure. And then Darcy Wilson and Sexton are very popular picks, 52%, 42% as well, respectively. So yeah, there's a few there. Finn McRae is still owned by 27%. We'll see what his ownership will be like after round 0. Getting back to Melbourne, so Billings, he actually looked quite good. He's 25% owned, 243k forward. So he had 93 points at 76% game time. So I'll be looking at probably bringing him in. He does have that round 6 bye, I think it is. But up until that, he's playing 6 games or so. So his price should jump dramatically if he's playing a game every week up until his bye. And it looks like he's probably got that half forward role that he's obviously very good at playing. So he's really good value. The other talking point out of this game, a bit of a surprise packet, was Christian Salem. Not many have obviously been convinced by that. Only 3% owned, 420k defender. But he played in the midfield. But he's likely there in place of Oliver But, Brayshaw's not playing as well, so Oliver doesn't play in round 0, or obviously doesn't play in round 1. Maybe Salem takes his place. But I actually think Oliver will play. He may not play round 0, but I think he'll be there for round 1, but, time will tell. Now going to some of the Carlton players. One of the interesting players there was Orazio Fantasia. Only 2% owned, so not many people jumped on him after that game. 175k forward. He started well, but he faded out pretty badly. Ended up with 36 points in 82% game time. So Zach Williams, now he played in the VFL and he got through the game unscathed. He'll likely line up, if not in round 0, then definitely in round 1. But again, we'll just keep an eye out for that round 0 game to see if he gets a game. So moving on to Gold Coast versus GWS. So for Gold Coast, Lockie Weller didn't play, and that has significance with Sexton and Butterick, but I think their positions are cemented in the team. For GWS, Ash, Cumming, Callahan, Hogan and Perryman were all the significant players that did not play in this game. So, for example, how does that affect Jacob Weir? He's obviously played on the wing, but Cumming or Ash didn't play, so how that's going to play out, we'll see. But Tom Green, he was fantastic. He looks very good, and he had 31 possessions and a goal for 118 points. There he is. He's 27% owned now, even though he's got the bye in round 3. A lot have jumped onto him, and probably after that game as well. So I think he got 118 points. I think that's about right. I actually think he'll average 120 this year, and that would be roughly a 10 or nearly a 10-point upside with Tom Green. So, but obviously the bye is scaring a few super coaches off, so that's understandable. Himmelberg, he did well playing at halfback or centre halfback. He had 20 possessions in 80% game time for 92 points. We'll just have to have a look at him in round 0 and have a look at him maybe after his bye to see how he's gone in his first few games. 2% owned, so he's a pod, I guess. 450k. We know how he's gone before when he's played in defence. And this is the first year that he's played had a full preseason in defence, and he's playing in defence for the whole year. So I think that will have an impact on his game, and I do see some upside in him, but I probably will look at him after his bye. Whitfield, he actually did all right. He had 15 possessions in 50% game time for 78 points. But again, obviously we'll wait in round 0 to see how he goes, and I think he's a player we may wait till after the bye. Excuse me. Josh Kelly, he had 19 possessions in 56% game time for 69 points. And rightly so. There's a lot of only 1% owned. 568k mid. He was a big talking point in the last couple of years, but probably not this year. Jacob Weir was, as I mentioned earlier, he was interesting. So he's only a 123k mid. And he's 7% owned, so it's probably gone up a little bit there. He had 12 possessions in 89% game time for 59 points. So we'll have a look. We'll see in round 0 if he actually gets a game, and then see if he lines up in round 1. But a lot of that is dependent on, as we said before, Cumming and Ash, and see whether he actually gets a spot. So look, he might be one of those rooks where he might play the first couple of games, but he may not have that job security. But yeah, we'll see. The other one actually sort of with Weir is Josh Fay. Only 3% owned, 136k mid. He had 16 possessions in 79% game time for 49 points. And yeah, he's unlikely to get a game, but again, we'll see next week. Going to the Gold Coast, so Sexton actually did quite well, a lot better than was expected. He had 31 possessions for 125 points, and it's no wonder that his ownership has just skyrocketed to 42%. It was at like 10% about a week ago, I think. So that's understandable because it looks like he's definitely playing at halfback. So I think he should be a lock in your team, especially if he lines up in round 0 and plays the same role. He took 6 kick-ins as well, and he played on from 4 of them, so that's good. Will Powell took 8 of them, so probably it'll rotate between the two of them to take the kick-ins. But he's locked and loaded in my team for now, and I see his ownership probably going up even further after round 0 if he ends up playing at halfback as well. So Tuke Miller, he had a good game. He had 33 possessions and a goal for 116 points. He played in the guts the whole time, and I think he'll be great value, a great value pick this year. So he's 23% owned. And I think obviously there'd be a few super coaches that would want to pick him, but they're scared off from the bye, and that's understandable. His bye's in round 3, so he might be one to pick up after that. He'll only have had 1 price increase, so he still might be really good value, especially if he's averaging 115 to 120 in his first few games. So as I mentioned before, Will Powell, he did all right. He actually had 25 possessions. And in 77% game time for 98 points. So it'll be interesting to see how Damien Hardwick is using him. He's a good pod because no one owns him. And no one wants to take the gamble. That's understandable. But, round 0, if he pulls out another, 100-point game, then, again, might be worth thinking about. Probably not necessarily a player that we may pick in our teams, but I thought it was interesting that Braden Fiorini looks like he has a definite role in that team now, playing on the wing. He had 19 possessions in 87% game time for 87 points, and he's only priced at 64. But again, those spots in the midfield are precious, and we can only fit a certain amount of players, of course. There's a lot of good value this year. But there's only so many players that we can fit into that midfield. The other one of interest that everyone was talking about was Sam Flanders, 32%, so it hasn't dropped off too much after that game. Probably many coaches are waiting to see how he goes in round 0. 494k forward, that most will pick him as a forward. He had 16 possessions in 83% game time for 65 points. So that was disappointing. But again, preseason game. So Hardwick, may have been testing things out. He was actually playing a fairly full team. It was really only Weller that wasn't playing. So he had his full team in. He may not necessarily have played everyone in the positions and the time on ground the way he's going to play them in round 0. So fortunately, we have round 0 to have a look at. Connor Buderick, he did all right. He had 20 possessions in 81% game time for 63 points. So here's another one we'll see next week in round 0, or this week I should say in round 0. Only 5% owned. He's 300k. But we'll see. He may end up locking down that role in a back pocket or something like that. I thought Raul, he did okay as well. He's only 2% owned. A good pod, 571k. 16 possessions in 67% game time for 61 points. The mids were used a little differently, I have to say, in this game. So I think we really need to keep an eye on round 0 to see how the mids will play, because in my opinion, I think it'll be, and this is what we're all expecting, I think it'll be Miller and Anderson and Raul. They will all play in the midfield. They'll all have well over 50-60% CBAs. I think Miller will probably have the most CBAs. And then Flanders will rotate through. Flanders will have less CBAs. But as we know from last year, Flanders didn't need the CBAs to actually play well in the back end of last year. The other one, he probably won't get a game, but Bodie Hewland, only 1% owned, 137k defender. He had 8 possessions in 24% game time for 28 points. He's rookie priced, but yeah, unlikely to get a game. And he got a fair bit of that ball in the last quarter. The heat had gone out of the game. In like a lot of these games, in that sort of back half, the third and fourth quarters, the heat goes out of the game, and you don't see that pressure. So you don't get a fair indication of how these players are going because it's a preseason game. We give it some indication, but we're an advantage. It's a disadvantage to have round 0, obviously, with some of the players we really want to pick, but it is an advantage because we do get to have a look at these rookies and these mid-prices, players we think are going to have upside, role changes, and that's what round 0 is really good for. Speaking of round 0, so Sydney and the Lions both play in round 0, and so Sydney and the Lions played against each other, and Lloyd and Mills, Papley, Parker, Chad Warner all didn't play in that team. So Chad Warner and Parker and Mills, all midfielders, and then Adams injured himself as well. So it'll be interesting to see when they have all their midfielders available, who's going to be getting all the CBAs, how they're going to rotate all these midfielders through. But for now, with those players not playing and dealing with injury, and now with Adams being injured, it does really pave the way for James Jordan. He had a really good game. Incidentally, with the Lions, Duday and McKenna didn't play, and they all played down back. So how that will impact Coleman and his role with Duday and McKenna in the team. He played with McKenna last year, but with Duday in the team as well. Again, hopefully if Duday is playing in round 0, we'll get a look at Coleman's role and how he does. But getting back to James Jordan, he had 31 possessions and 116 points. Now, and he played mostly on the wing and a little bit of inside mid. And so with all these midfielders missing, I think James Jordan is going to be a great value pick for this year. So I'm going to be looking at trading him in. For me, very likely I'm going to be just swapping Adams out for Jordan. And then with the extra cash, I'll look at probably strengthening up probably my defense, I reckon. My defense I feel is a bit weak. So I'll look at probably strengthening my defense, maybe upgrading Winhager to someone. But yeah, I'll see after round 0 what I'll do there. Now, Roberts, he did well. Matt Roberts, he had 18 possessions for 100 points in 79% game time, playing at halfback. But we have to remember that Lloyd and Rampy didn't play in this game. Actually, that was the other player I missed that didn't play in this game from Sydney, was Dane Rampy. So, when Lloyd and Rampy come back into the team, how does that impact Roberts? Does he still get a game? Is he play as the sub? We'll have to see. Goulden is such a gun. He is fantastic. He's going to have such a good year this year. He got 133 points with 24 possessions and a goal. And if you have him as a premium, you can feel pretty happy with that performance. And the other thing too is that Sydney have a great run to start the season. So I think Goulden is going to smash it. I haven't paid as much attention to Goulden in my research, but only recently I have, and obviously particularly after this game and when I saw him play, I was like, yeah, wow. I actually think he's got actually plenty of upside. Averaged 111 last year, but I think he could potentially average 120, 115, 120. So again, the only thing that's putting everyone off is he has the round 5 bye. But yeah, it might be worth it. He's still playing 5 games. And with that fantastic run to start the season, who knows what he could be averaging by the time his bye comes around. And if he ends up averaging that 115 to 120 and you're planning to get him in after his bye, might not be able to afford him. So, these are some of the things that we have to weigh up. I thought Sheldrick was okay. he was 15. He had 15 possessions, 43 points, 78% game time. Probably won't play round 0 and round 1, even with all the injuries to the midfielders. But we'll see. You never know. There might be a place for him there. I was really interested in him, the way he did, how well he did last year, but a little bit off him now that they've brought in Adams and Jordan. So Brodie Grundy. So this is going to be very interesting. We're going to be a close watch on Brodie Grundy in round 0. He got 65 points in 60% game time. So the point per minute is great. So that was really good. It wasn't a dominating performance, but we have to remember that he played with Adams. Adams is not going to be there in round 0 or round 1. He will ruck solo. So he only scored that and only had 60% game time because my feeling is they wanted to get more game time into Laddams, because if something happens to Grundy and he gets injured, they need to bring Laddams into the team. So it's good to get him give him a run in the ruck and give him some game time. It did look like, watching the game, it did look like they didn't want to risk Grundy, to be honest. I mean, I think they're expecting him to play every game in the ruck solo. So it's a long season. So it doesn't surprise me that they, just used him sparingly in this game. But round 0, we'll be keeping a close eye on Grundy. So yeah, Adams, unfortunately, he got injured. Still 7% owned. So I think by the time round 1 starts, that'll drop. So he had 15 possessions, 45 points, 50% game time. That's not too bad. But unfortunately, he injured his medial ligament in a tackle, and he's going to miss the next 3 to 4 weeks. So yeah, I'll be looking at probably trading him out to Jordan. So going over to some of the players for Brisbane. Lachie Neale, so 4% owned. There's a few jumping on him. I remember from a few years ago, everyone was jumping onto Lachie Neale. But then after last year, he still averaged 110. So it's not too bad. He had 22 possessions and 124 points in just 65% game time. Now, he's at a pretty good price for him. But is there upside? I'm not really sure. And that also goes even for Dunkley, who also did well. He had 23 possessions and 99 points in just 69% game time. So it looks like they just, like Fagan really just shared the load a little bit in this game, and sort of shared the midfield around a little bit. But yeah, Neale and Dunkley, I mean, they're expensive. But then, do you feel that they're going to have plenty of upside this year? Dunkley still averaged 115 last year. So can he go to 120? Well, not really too sure. I don't think so, personally. But, it was his first year playing for Brisbane, a new style, new players, getting used to it. So after a year now in the system and another pre-season with Brisbane and the players, and getting used to the strategy and structure from Fagan, maybe he has a better year this year. So Kitty Coleman was the other interesting one. So he had 19 possessions and 89 points from just 74% game time. And as I've said, I'm not starting any Brisbane or Carlton players. I'll be looking at them after their bye. Obviously, I've got Zach Williams in the team for now, and that's just because he's great value. And that's why I've just kept him in. But, I mean, Kitty Coleman's also very good value, nearly 400k, 25% owned. So there are a few jumping on him. But, his price doesn't change up until his buy. So if he's averaging 110, for example, up until his buy, then yeah, I'll be looking at trying to get him in. I'll use some of these extra trades we've been given. So we've got 40 trades. Maybe I'll use some of these trades to bring him in then after his buy. But yeah, we'll have a good look at him anyway next week. And remembering too that Duday has to come back into that team. So how that impacts Coleman as well, I'm not sure. Moving on to the Essendon and Geelong game. So Draper was missing. Kelly and Hobbs, Heppel, Shield, all those players were missing from the Bombers. For the Cats, Ollie Henry and Gary Rowan and Cam Guthrie all didn't play. So Guthrie's out for a while. So Geelong went in, I guess, fairly full strength. But starting with Essendon, and for me, where my focus was on Nick Martin. He's now jumped up to 18% in ownership. He's at 492k, and in the first quarter, he kicked a goal and set up two, and one with a beautiful precision kick over a Cats player onto the chest of a leading forward. He's got exquisite skills, and it's clearly quite clear that Scott wants to use him as that in that Dacos kind of role, that off halfback, kind of roaming up the ground, up the wing, into the forward line as well, and just basically roaming around and doing what he wants. And if that's the case, he's going to get a lot of ball. So I'm very bullish on Nick Martin this year. He's in his third year. The trajectory is there, the upward trend, third year breakout, all of that. Everything is just positive around Nick Martin for this year. So I've definitely got him in my team. Darcy Parish, he actually obviously played very well. He had 34 possessions and a goal for 124 points. He'll be a really good premium this year. But, he still struggles with a tag. So, he's probably likely to get a tag this year, I would say. A few times throughout the year, but, we'll see how he handles that. Zach Merritt, he's just the ever reliable Zach Merritt, 7% owned, 650k. He had 25 possessions and 112 points. Another safe premium if you're kind of feeling Zach Merritt and he's in your team and he's one of the premiums you want to go with, then you're going to have a pretty safe captain choice there as well. 116 he averaged last year, and I can't really see that changing. Jordan Ridley. So we know now that he had a little bit of a quad injury. I think it was a quad injury. 2% owned, 530k defender. He had 18 possessions in 57% game time for 77 points. So he did quite well. He will likely, maybe he'll play round one. I think they have to do further testing, but could likely miss. So yeah, if you own Ridley, you have to keep an eye on that. Zach Reed was the one I think we were all interested in as well. 37% owned, 123k defender. Now, he got 15 possessions in 92% game time for 80 points. That's a great sign. He played 92% of the game and had 80 points, and he looked really good. Now, he's not going to get 80 points every game, but I think at the very least, he's worth a spot on your bench at 123k. Now, going over to the Cats, Max Holmes. He had a very good game. So only 4% owned, 446k, but it looks like he's also got that halfback role. Look, he's also a prime midfielder with Guthrie out too. So how he's going to be used in the midfield or at halfback, I'm not really too sure. But in that first quarter, he had 9 possessions in 89% game time for 40 points. And he finished with 29 possessions and a goal in 65% game time for 108 points. So there's a lot of these mid-price midfielders at that price point. When you consider Nick Martin and Ollie Wines and Matt Crouch and Carl Amon. And so there's a fair few of them in around that price, that 450 or so price, 450 to 500. That's a lot of good mid prices there that have a lot of upside. And I think Max Holmes this year is definitely one of those players. Jai Clark, he's 47% owned now, and that's fair enough. 123k mid, especially after this game. He had 17 possessions in 69% game time for 85 points. And with Guthrie injured, I think Jai Clark will get more opportunity. At the very least, he's a good bench option. I think he should be there in round one. Tom Stewart, he also played fairly well, 15 possessions and a goal in 68% game time for 74 points. He's a good premium, good choice in your defense. 29% owned, 635k defender. If you have him in your team, if he's one of the premiums you've picked, you may well have picked him in placement of in place of Dacos, because Dacos has the bye. And that's understandable. It's a strategy most are using. Stewart played well. No signs of him dropping off. And he's actually also got a pretty good trajectory in the last few years as well. So could he get up to that 115 average? Yeah, potentially. Mano was also one that we were looking at because he's a 117k mid forward and he's 45% owned. So I'd say a lot of coaches, no doubt, would want to have him in their team because of his price. Now, he only had 8 possessions and a goal in 27% game time for 44 points. Based on that performance, because I think he came on like late or in the second half, but he is... It's unlikely that he's going to start round 1, or at the very least, maybe he'll start as the sub. I could see him playing as the sub. So, we'll have to see when the teams get named for round 1 what they do with Mana. So moving over to the Port and Freo game. So Port put in a full strength team. There was no one really missing from that team. So out of all the teams that we got to look at over the weekend or in these preseason games, I think Port was the one that gave us the best indication of how players will be used. For Freo, Amos and Luke Jackson and Brennan Cox and Heath Chapman all didn't play. So if we're thinking about Freo and any forward players, like Patrick Voss, which I'll talk about soon, we got to consider that Amos and Luke Jackson didn't play. And then Heath Chapman, he's lined up for the wing, so when he comes back, what's going to happen there? Brendan Cox plays in defense, so again, how that's going to impact the players, we'll see. The good thing with this game as well was that of all the games that I watched, which was all of them, the intensity and the pressure of that game was as close to an AFL game that I saw of all the games. So it gave us a really good indication, especially with Port having a full team and playing at that intensity and pressure for most of the game, or at least half the game. It gave us a good indication of their team and how they're going to use their players. So Butters, Rosie and Wines started in the middle. Horne-Francis started in the forward line, and that will be the 4 mids for this year. They will rotate through midfield and forward. Butters rolled his right ankle very early in the first quarter, and then they rested him for the rest of the game as a precaution. There's nothing to worry about at all. If you actually saw how he injured himself, it was... It wasn't like in a contest or a tackle or anything. He was actually just skipping backwards and then just stepped on the side of his foot and just rolled it. If this was an AFL game during the regular season, they would have treated it and put him back onto the ground. But because they've got 2 weeks before they play, why not just rest your gun player? And that's what they did. So he will be fine. So if you've got Butters in your team, as I have, then you don't need to worry about any injuries or anything. He'll be okay. It's just a rolled ankle. 25% owned, 636k mid. Definitely worth it. I think he is going to have a great year. I think he's going to average between 115 to 120 in my opinion. Horne-Francis. Now, I know that I have been big on Horne-Francis this year, and I've mentioned him a few times in my videos. I was watching him very closely and he looks absolutely fantastic. I love the way he plays. He's got such power and pace and a penetrating kick. He's actually great to watch, and I've mentioned in my previous videos as well that to add to the Supercoach experience, it's great when you've got some players in your team that you actually enjoy watching the way they play. So for me, that's Dacos and LDU. and Horne-Francis. I really do enjoy the way they play footy. So I've got him in my team. I know that they're another 30k more or so when you've got Ollie Wines. And there's a few obviously big on him, but for now I've got Horne-Francis in the team because I think there's upside. I'll see how he goes in the first few games, and if he's a bust, then I should be able to get him up to another mid-pricer that's obviously doing well. But I'm pretty bullish on Horne-Francis this year, but anything can happen, of course. But I think Horne-Francis is going to become a great player. I think if he can average anywhere between 50 to 70% CBAs this year, then I think he'll have a good year. Now, having said all of that, it is a bit difficult to assess how Horne-Francis, Ollie Wines, how these guys went, because Butters wasn't actually playing in the game. So with Horne-Francis, he actually ended up with 26 possessions in 80% game time for 105 points. So I was really happy with that, and I'll very likely keep him in my team and start him in round one. Connor Rozee, now that he's got the captaincy, he's just leading from the front, 10% owned, 601k mid. He had 26 possessions and a goal in 73% game time for 113 points. Another safe premium for the year with upside. I think if you've got him in your team, you can be pretty happy with that performance, and he'll have a very good year. Ollie Wines obviously was one that many I think were looking at to see whether he was going to play midfield, and he started in the midfield. He's 8% owned, 463k mid, so he's a good value pick. He had 27 possessions and a goal in 76% game time for 130 points. And he played predominantly in the midfield. He looks fit. He looks ready to go. I think he's a great value pick. I could very easily jump up to from Horne-Francis to Ollie Wines. I've got the cash to do it. I'm just sticking with Horne-Francis, I think, for now. And we'll have a look after the first couple of rounds before their prices jump up. And if Ollie Wines is clearly dominating and Horne-Francis maybe is playing more time in the forward line, maybe I'll make that change. But I think if you've got Ollie Wines in your team, I think he's going to go back to his 100-point average from a few years ago. And he's only priced at 83, so there's definite upside there. So Jace Burgoyne was another interesting one. Whether he gets a game round one, we'll see. Only 2% owned, 179k defender. He had 20 possessions in 63% game time for 67 points. It does look like he'll line up on the wing and play in round one. Remember, as I said before, Port were playing a full-strength team, and Burgoyne was in that team, and he was playing roughly around the wing. Now, he's a bit expensive for a defender, but he could be a good option, either at D6 or on your bench. But yeah, he's an interesting one to watch. Jordan Sweet, he had 8 possessions and 11 hitouts in 43% game time for 62 points. Still not sure what Port is going to do here, whether they'll ruck both Soldo and Sweet at the same time, or whether it'll just be Soldo. But I think with Naismith likely to play the first few rounds, I think he's probably a better option at 123k. So going over to Freo, and when you look at their midfield, pretty much was Brayshaw, Sarong, and Fife. They all started in the middle. Young started at halfback, but then Young was moved into the centre bounce straight away after that second goal, about 3 minutes into the game. So that will be their midfield. That'll be the rotating midfield, and Fife pretty much played the entire midfield, but it was really Hayden Young. He really stood out. He played a great game. He looked great, played mostly mid, a little bit of halfback, had 26 possessions and kicked 2 goals, 3 goals, 3, had plenty of shots on goal in 75% game time for 115 points. Great value pick in defense this year, only 40% owned, 525k defender, definitely worth it. Caleb Sarong. Now, I am bullish on Sarong. I've got him in my team at the moment. So he's 11% owned, 621k mid. He had 29 possessions in 81% game time for 95 points. I still expect him to average anywhere between 110 to 120, likely 115 to 120, I think. So if you have him in your team, you can be happy with that, and he'll have a very good year. Jordan Clark. Now, he's only owned by 1%. There's been some talk about Clark, but not many people picking him in their team. 461k defender. He looks like he's got that Hayden Young role from last year, playing at halfback and taking the kick-ins. He had 19 possessions in 79% game time for 84 points. He's only averaged at 82, but there's every chance that he could probably get up to that 90-point average, 90 to 100 maybe. But we'll have to wait and see, I guess, to see what kind of role that he's got. Brayshaw, he did very well, Andrew Brayshaw. He had 24 possessions, 79% game time for 84 points. Pretty much played mostly in the middle. There's talk of him maybe moving to the wing a little bit as well. He's only 4% owned, so he is a great pod. 608k mid. The only thing with him is I don't see a lot of upside. Like, he's a 109-point average. I don't see him going to like a 115-point average, personally, in my opinion. But we'll just have to wait and see how he gets used. So as I was mentioning earlier, Nat Fyfe, 51% owned now, 283k mid forward. And we all just wanted to see his role in this game, and Fyfe was really good. He's definitely lost some pace, no doubt, but his contested ability is still there. He had 26 possessions in 75% game time for 72 points. And in those 26 possessions, he actually did have a lot of handballs. So hopefully he can actually kick a little bit more. But he's priced at around 50. I mean, I think he's got minimum 20-point upside. He'll average 70 for the year as a minimum if he's playing full-time mid. An interesting one I didn't expect to be playing was Oscar McDonald. He's only 1% owned, 123k defender. And I think of the players missing, it was Brennan Cox out of defense. So maybe when Brennan Cox comes in, he takes McDonald's spot. McDonald still had 12 possessions. He took 7 marks in 89% game time for 70 points. And he's only a 123k defender. And he looked really good. I do think he's in line for a spot in round 1. So maybe just keep an eye on him. I've got Hoare in my team at the moment. I don't see him playing in round 0 or round 1. Maybe I'll change him over to McDonald, or when we get to the Hawks game, maybe even Ethan Phillips. But yeah, McDonald's one to keep an eye on. Now, Patrick Voss, he actually played very well, looked good, only 1% owned, 123k forward. Had 11 possessions and kicked a goal in 86% game time for 75 points. He did look good, but look, he's unlikely to play round 1, especially with Luke Jackson and Amos to come back into that team. But yeah, anyway, another one to keep an eye on. I have to say, I was a bit disappointed in Jeremy Sharp. I mean, I shouldn't really expect too much because he's rookie priced, but I expected a little bit better from him. I think he just got a few cheap possessions towards the back half of the game when the heat was really out of the game. He's still likely to hold his spot on the wing. He had 10 possessions and kicked a goal in 77% game time for 51 points. So, as a rook, 123k mid, I mean, he's still worth probably having on your bench as long as he's lining up in round 1. And just lastly for Freo, the other interesting play to keep an eye on is Cooper Simpson, 117k mid forward, 9% owned. He had 12 possessions, kicked a goal, and 78% game time for 33 points. So, didn't really play. As far as Supercoach goes, didn't really get the points we were hoping for, but I think he's more of a sub type of player as opposed to fitting into that best 22. But we'll just keep an eye on round 1, I guess. So for the Crows and the Eagles, so in that game, Sloan he didn't play. But other than that, I think the Crows pretty much had a full-strength team. For the Eagles, Jinby and Sheed were missing, so two of their main midfielders. Oscar Allen didn't play, Liam Ryan didn't play, so they're forwards. And Matt Flynn, of course, didn't play, so a few of those guys still having injuries. But the player of interest in this game was Sam Berry. And I've spoken about Sam Berry before, how in his first couple of years the trend was great. Then last year was supposed to be his breakout year, third-year breakout, and he only played 4 games. He just disappeared. But in this game, he had 22 possessions and kicked 2 goals in 72% game time for 115 points. And he's priced at an average of 50, and he's 227k, so 3% owned. Now, if he's lining up in round 1 and he's not named as the sub, I think he's definitely a player that's worth thinking about, especially considering that the Crows pretty much had a full-strength team. Maybe Berry goes out for Sloan, I'm not sure. But if he's there in round 1, yeah, he's a player to think about, because maybe he could be that 4th player rotating through. You got Crouch, Laird, and Dawson. And maybe they rotate Berry through there a lot more. And then on occasion, when they want to inject some pace into the midfield, then maybe they bring in Rankin or Rochelle. Matt Crouch, he actually had a pretty decent game. So he's 7% owned, 490k mid. He had 23 possessions, including 10 contested possessions, with 100% efficiency in 59% game time for 115 points. Just in 59% game time. That's fantastic. I think he's definitely confirmed himself as an underpriced mid-pricer for this season, and definitely worth one to consider for your team. I think he's definitely going to have a good year. But like I said, there's so many of these mid-prices in there. There may even be a strategy if, for some of these super coaches that may only have these mid-prices in there. Maybe your F1 might even be maybe 1 premium, and then the rest of your M2, M3, M4, M5, M6 all might be these mid prices. I mean, that's an option, I guess. Rory Laird, he was okay. So he's 7% owned, 653k mid, so technically he's kind of a pod at 7% owned. Had 26 possessions, 18 of them were handballs, unfortunately, in 72% game time for 89 points. So points per minute were very good. So I think Laird will have a good year, but if you consider a lot of these players that are going to be rotating through the midfield, maybe that impacts Laird, and then if that's the case, it'll impact any upside that he might have. Rochelle did all right. He's only 1% owned, 413k forward. Unlikely that many teams are going to pick him, but he was rotating through the middle. There's probably some upside there. He had 14 possessions, which included 3 goals in 82% game time for 81 points. He's in his 3rd year, so there's a potential 3rd-year breakout, and he'll spend a bit of time in the middle this year for sure. And he's a pod, but whether you think he's worth having, maybe not. Well, I'm definitely not picking him, but there could be some upside with him. Dawson, he did quite well. 28 possessions, kicked a goal, 66% game time only for 90 points. I'm not sure whether Dawson will be affected like Laird. Possibly with a lot of these other players rotating through, but either way, I don't see a lot of upside. He's 17% owned, 647k mid, but in this game, Adelaide really did share the CBAs around, and whether they're going to do that throughout the year, if so, then that is going to impact Dawson and Laird. We'll see how that plays out throughout the year. For the Eagles, so Yeo, Kelly, and Reed got most of the CBAs. So Elliot Yeo, so he's 8% owned, So kind of a pod. I've got him in my team. I'm pretty happy to keep him there. Defender mid, 447k. Now he had 16 possessions, which included 9 tackles in 76% game time for 97 points. And I love the fact that he had 9 tackles. It's always a good sign if a player's coming off an injury and they've had a full preseason, hopefully, and if they're tackling, that's a great sign. So he's a good mid-price defender, looks good, looked healthy and fit, looking at him run around. So I'm pretty happy with him in my team. Witherden is an interesting one. Again, no one really owns him. 1% owned. 472k defender. He had 17 possessions in 70% game time for 82 points. So it looks like he's probably taking over that Shannon Hearn role. And if that's the case, then he should have a decent year. With the Hawks and the Doggies in that game, we had a few players missing, actually, especially from Hawthorn. Will Day probably won't play round 1. Weddle wasn't playing. And Gunston, Dylan Moore, Jayath, Blank, Wingard. Wingard's out till the middle of the year. Blank's out for the whole year. Jayath's out for a fair few weeks, start of the year. Dylan Moore's got glandular fever. He might play round 1, but he's not going to be 100%, I don't think. And then Will Day, yeah, he's out for a little bit. So we'll see how this team structures up. For the Doggies, McRae, Bailey Dale, Alex Keith, Bailey Smith, of course, they all didn't play. And the first half of this game was actually played with pretty decent intensity, and then the game just dropped away. The heat kind of dropped out in the second half. But there are a lot of players to talk about in this game, and best to just start off at the top with Sicily. So he's still 24% owned, 637k defender, but he had 15 possessions, 13 of those were kicks in 93% game time for just 52 points. That is a concern because he did man up on lob, and with a lot of the injuries to defenders, is he going to play that role through the season where he's actually going to man up on someone? So yeah, good to keep a close eye on that with Sicily, because with a lot of these players that aren't there, like we know the stats and the history when Blank is not playing, how it affects the Hawks, and affects Sicily. So yeah, be an interesting one to keep an eye on for any Sicily owners out there. Newcomb, he also played very well. He had 37 possessions in 84% game time for 126 points. Now he's in his 3rd year, so it could be one of those 3rd year breakouts. The trajectory is pretty good. He's the Hawks' prime midfielder, 9% owned, so that's pretty decent. 549k mid, so 9% is pretty good for a player like Newcomb. Carl Amon was the one I think that many were looking at. Now he's only 2% owned. There's been lots of talk about Carl Amon, but only 2% owned. So here's a pod, 483k mid. He played at halfback, so the role was confirmed, and it looks like he's got that role. He had 28 possessions in 78% game time for 96 points, and I think he should average around that 100 mark this year. And if that's the case, then there's a good 14 points upside with Amon. And he'll definitely, like Martin, he'll definitely get defender status. So that could be add really good flexibility to your team, where you could actually trade out some of your low-end rookie defenders and swap them with Martin or Amon and upgrade them when they make some cash. So that's a good strategy to have, I think. I know some are considering Connor McDonald. He's, I think, a forward, or is he a mid? Where is he? Connor McDonald. There we go. Connor McDonald. So only 1% owned, 381k forward, bit pricey. He looked good. Had 19 possessions, 2 goals in 89% game time for 96 points. So yeah, he looked all right. But, we've still got Gunston and Dylan Moore to come back into that forward line, so just keep that in mind. Mackenzie was the other one. He's a forward as well, 2% owned, 271k forward. Looked good, 19 possessions and 1 goal in 85% game time for 90 points. He was sort of rotating between mid and forward. But again, there's some mids and some forwards to come back into that Hawthorn team. Again, Henry Hustwaite, one to just think about. He's only 184k mid. He's 15% owned. So his ownership's jumped, probably because of his last 2 games playing in the midfield. Looked really good, especially in that first half, but then he faded away in the second half. He ended up with 17 possessions in 73% game time for 82 points. So, yeah, he could be one to have a look at. D'Ambrosio, I think he looked a good player in probably the wing. I guess it was a wing halfback type role. 18 possessions in 76% game time for 77 points. But we've got to remember that Weddle still has to come back into that team. So we'll see if he gets a game. He's 10% owned. So there's a few super coaches out there that have some confidence in him. And he's a 224k defender. Ethan Phillips, he is a player that Hawthorn just drafted in. 102k rook, 22% owned. So I think everyone's jumping on him. He'll fill in likely for blank this year. So he'll likely be named in round 1. He had 10 possessions, 6 marks in 83% game time for 56 points. So he should make some cash, but could be a slow burn. For the Doggies, Sam Darcy didn't play in this game. He played in the earlier VFL game. Kicked 4 goals, 3 though. But whether he plays round 1, it's unlikely. So I probably will be trading him out of my team. Riley Sanders, he started at half forward. Treloar, Bont and Libba started in the middle. And then Sanders rotated through the middle. And I actually think that will be the midfield for this year. And maybe a few others might pinch hit, but I reckon that's how they'll roll the Doggies with their midfield. Libba led the way. He's just a gun. 6% owned, 648k mid. Even with McGuinness tagging him for a little bit as well, he got 30 possessions, 7 tackles in 79% game time for 136 points. Just going to have another great year, I think. Bont is Bont. 40% owned, 724k mid. I think he's a bit pricey, but completely understandable at the same time that he's 40% owned. He looked amazing, especially that goal that he kicked when he ran through 3 Hawthorn players and then kicked it from just inside 50. He looks good, looks in good form, looks like the injury that he had isn't hampering him. He had 32 possessions, 8 tackles, kicked the goal. And in 83% game time for 135 points. So yes, absolutely can understand anyone starting him. He's a captain choice every week. Now, speaking of captain choices every week, Tim English also doesn't look to be hampered by the migraine concerns that he had. He's 12% owned, 715k ruck. He had 15 possessions, 7 tackles, 26 hitouts in 85% game time for 134 points. So again, at the same time, another safe pick. He'll average, that 130 mark again, roughly. So again, I like to start my teams with a bit of value. I don't really like picking players well over 700,000 like Bont and English, but for those super coaches out there that have got him, he's a safe pick. And if you're happy to spend that kind of cash on him, then I guess he's a safe pick for your team for the year. Adam Treloar actually played quite well. He's not owned by anyone. That's probably understandable. 601k mid. There's a lot of other value picks out there. But I only bring him up because he looked really good, and apparently he's had a full preseason, no hiccups, no injuries or surgery for like the first time in many years. He had 28 possessions, but 20 of them were handballs, unfortunately. Kicked 1 goal in 83% game time for 118 points. So, if you're looking for a pod, he could be a pod to consider. Riley Sanders, He had a great game. 30 possessions in 80% game time for 86 points. A definite starter in your team at M7 or at M8 or on your bench. He's 66% owned, 184k mid. Really should be owned by more than 66%, I think. But yeah, absolute starter for sure. James Harms, 14% owned, 258k mid forward. I've got him in my team as well. And he looked all right. He had 17 possessions, 5 tackles, kicked 1 goal in 72% game time for 74 points. And that's kind of all we're wanting. I mean, he's priced at an average of 46. So if he can average 70, there's like a 24-point upside. So that's all you can ask for some of these sort of lower end mid prices. And I think he'll definitely start in round 1, as will Caulfield. And he was all right. 14 possessions, 13 of those were kicks, 6 marks, 82% game time for 51 points, 123k defender, 58% owned. And I think most teams will probably have him at D6, as I have, or on the bench. And he'll definitely be in the team in round 1. So just getting to the last game now, the Saints and North. So Sinclair, Crouch, Winhager, Dan Butler all didn't play for the Saints. So that does make a difference. That's 2 midfielders, Crouch and Winhager, and then 1 defender there, and Sinclair didn't play. Hunter Clark didn't play as well, and Paddy Dow didn't play, so how they fit in the team too. For North, Luke McDonald didn't play. That's very significant. I'll explain why in a moment. Liam Shields, Aidan Core, Griffin Logan, a lot of those players are out for a while, but they didn't play. But Zach Fisher, of course, was the talking point of this game. He had 36 possessions in 82% game time for 132 points. He's 20% owned, 378k forward. So he's going to play in that halfback role, but there are a few things to take into consideration. So firstly, Luke McDonald wasn't there. And when he comes back into the team, he will also probably play around halfback. We also have to remember that Sheasel, Bailey Scott, and McKercher all played off halfback as well. And then Luke McDonald comes back in, so it doesn't mean that Fisher's not going to average. He could well still average 80 to 90, but he's not averaging 132. He's not averaging 120 or even 110. But he could very well average. He could have potentially a good 15 to 20 point upside. But we'll see how North use all the players off halfback. Charlie Lazaro, there's been a bit of talk about him. He actually played quite well, 14% owned now, 181k mid forward. He had 22 possessions in 84% game time for 68 points. So it looks like that he'll be playing a mid half forward type role. He had 29% CBAs in this game, so that's the way that they're going to play him, and he's definitely a chance for round 1. George Wardlaw came back from injury and played in this game. He's 10% owned, 365k mid. He had 22 possessions in 84% game time for 68 points. So it looks like he'll be playing. Sorry, actually, I just gave you the stats for Lazaro. Sorry about that. With Wardlaw, he only had 10 possessions, but he had 12 tackles in 74% game time for 63 points. And as I said, he's coming off that sort of minor injury. So hence, not the best performance, but he's definitely lining up in round 1, and he'll be playing primarily midfield the whole season. The good thing is that he did tackle really well. 12 tackles, that's great. Watching the game, he was tough, played hard. He's going to be a great player for North. But the only issue, the only concern I have is, will his minutes be managed? That's sort of the main concern. Tristan Sherry, he actually did quite well, 7% owned. 407k ruck. He had 16 possessions, 31 hitouts in 85% game time for 99 points. So he had a pretty decent game, particularly because he was rucking against Rowan Marshall as well for most of the game. So that's a pretty good performance from Sherry. And he could very well be good value, priced at 73 roughly, and he could very much average around that 90 mark potentially. There's a lot of hype around him. I just don't think the hype was worth what he'll put out, but there's potential upside with him. Zane Dersma. He had a pretty decent game, 33% owned, a lot higher than I thought. 193k mid forward. He had 14 possessions, kicked 2 goals in 84% game time for 81 points. He's likely to start in round 1, playing around half forward, but I do worry about him being the sub in some games. That'll be my only concern with him. McKercher, he did all right, 63% owned, 202k mid. He had, don't really have the number now for possessions that he had, but he played in 78% game time for 55 points. So again, nothing really to worry about here with him. His scoring is going to fluctuate throughout the year. But he's an absolute round 1 starter, and he should play most of the games throughout the year this year. So yeah, he's a must-have, just like Sanders and Harley Reid. So LDU, this is very interesting. So 11% owned. I would say that he has dropped in ownership since that game, 635k mid. It looked like Ross and Steele were doing a run with role with LDU or a soft tag, I guess you could say. LDU had 14 possessions, but he gave away 6 free kicks in 79% game time for 36 points, which is horrible. Now, if you've got LDU in your team, as I have, you might be concerned about that performance, but you need to take into account probably a few things. And one of these things is a stat I just want to share with you from Fantasy Freako. It was a really good stat. So he tweeted out that if you have LDU in your team, don't take him out because of this poor score in a preseason game. He scored 55 last year in a preseason game, then followed that up with 143, 155, and 102 in his first 3 home and away games. As I said at the start, premiums do not try in preseason games because it's just not worth it. They just need to get a bit of run in their legs and just dust off the cobwebs a little bit, get a little bit of form, and then actually put in when the season actually starts. So, yeah, I wouldn't be worried too much about LDU. I mean, they're premiums for a reason. He's not going to average 33 for the season. He's not going to average 80 for the season. He's averaged well over 100 in the past, so that's what he will average. So yeah, I would be holding on to him. Now for St Kilda, Rowan Marshall, he did well, 7% owned, 639k ruck. So English, Marshall, all these players are low percentage ownership for the kind of players they are, and that's because everyone's going the Gaundy combination. But for Marshall, he had 19 possessions, 12 hitouts, kicked a goal, 79% game time for 102 points. So yeah, he's a good pick if you've got him in your team. I think that his price might drop a little bit at first, but he's still a premium and still a good pick. If you're wanting to pay up for him, then yeah, he'll definitely have a good year. Wanganeen Malira, he played a very good game. Sinclair wasn't there though, so take that into consideration. He's 7% owned, 475k defender. He had 24 possessions, 10 marks, and 79% game time for 106 points, I think it was, that he got. Now, he's a must-have for your team. Sorry, I'm getting confused. I've shared Darcy Wilson's stats, mix the stats up a little bit. Sorry, with Wangani Malira, he had 29 possessions in 85% game time for 107 points. So yes, he will have a good year, but with Sinclair out of the team, I don't know how serious we can take those stats into consideration, but he'll still have a good year, and there's still upside with him. Darcy Wilson is, I think, a player that many teams are going to have. 52% owned, 130k mid forward. He had 24 possessions, 10 marks, and 79% game time for 106 points. So he's a must-have for your team, in my opinion, I think. So I've got him in my midfield at the moment on the bench. But yeah, I could move him forward. But yeah, good flexibility to have him there. And yeah, I think he'll probably play wing half forward for the Saints. So I think definitely a player to have in your team. Jack Steele, he did all right as well. 14% owned, 529k mid. He's definitely underpriced. He had 21 possessions, 16 were handballs, unfortunately. Laid 9 tackles in 79% game time for 111 points. So the good thing to note in this game is that he had the 9 tackles. And also had 12 contested possessions. So that's a sign to me that he's fit, that his body's in good condition, that he's healthy, and that he's not carrying any injuries. Because if he was, he wouldn't be tackling as what occurred last year. And I think in this game, I just watching him play, I think he was just cruising a little bit in this game, and yet he still scored quite well. So I think he's a good pick for the season. And the last player I want to comment on is Ari Schoenmaker. Only 4% owned, 117k defender. Will he get a game? Not sure. Sinclair still has to come back in that team. He had 16 possessions, 11 marks, 79% game time for 60 points. He's a cheap rookie defender, but I'd be concerned about his job security, because when we're picking rookies, we want to make money off them, but they need to play. We don't want them to be subbed. We don't want them to miss games. We want them to play every single week. So it's important that we pick rookies that have great job security so that they earn us good money. So in my case, looking at my team, I mean, Hoare has to go. Jai Clark, I'll probably be a bit concerned about. Livingston, I will be changing over to Naismith, definitely, particularly if he's playing in round 0. And then Sam Darcy, I think I'll trade out too. So I've got to make a few moves there as well. So anyway, there's a fair bit of information to take out of the preseason games. But we got the round 0 games this week. We need to keep a close eye on them. That'll give us a great indication of how certain players go, rookies, role changes, all those kinds of things. So I'll definitely be watching every one of those games. And then I'll post a video immediately after the last game on Sunday, I think it is, and review those round 0 games. So thanks again for watching, or thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you again in my next video.